The Iron Gate. We hiked out the next morning. The woods were unnaturally quiet for October. There were no birds singing, no squirrels rustling in the dead leaves, just the heavy, rhythmic thud of our boots and the sound of Vance's ragged breathing. As we got closer to the sluice, the forest grew dense and choked with black briars. The air began to change. It wasn't just cold, it felt heavy, like the atmospheric pressure before a violent thunderstorm. Then we saw it, the Red Creek Sluice. It looked like a massive concrete scar cutting through the earth, 30 feet deep and 20 feet wide, choked with rusted iron rebar and decades of rotting timber. At the very end of the channel, where the mountain water was supposed to drain into the valley, was a massive subterranean overflow tunnel. The opening was covered by a heavy iron gate, but the thick bars had been melted and warped downward, creating a gaping black mouth. Vance didn't hesitate. He scrambled down the steep concrete incline, sliding through the mud right up to the edge of the dark tunnel. "Vance, wait!" I called out, a sudden cold dread seizing my chest. "This place is unstable. We shouldn't be down here." "Just a few feet inside, Caleb," Vance called back, his voice echoing weirdly against the concrete. "The marker goes just inside the threshold. Come on, help your old uncle out." I swallowed the lump in my throat and followed him down. The moment my boots hit the floor of the tunnel, the temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted. My breath immediately turned to thick white plumes in the dark. The air tasted heavy and wet, like copper and stale grease. I pulled out my high-intensity tactical flashlight and switched it on. The Ghost of Blood Creek. When I was 11 years old, my older brother, Jesse, vanished from the face of the earth. It happened during the late autumn timber harvest out in the dense ridges just north of Blackberry Creek. Jesse was working the late shift with our cousin, Silas. According to Silas, the two of them had been tying down a load of white oak on the back of a flatbed when Jesse realized he'd dropped his favorite pocket knife, the one our grandfather had given him, back near the logging clearing about a quarter-mile up the mountain trail. Silas told him to leave it until morning, but Jesse was stubborn. He walked back into the darkening tree line with nothing but a plastic flashlight. He never came out. The state police brought in search dogs, and local volunteers combed those ridges for 3 weeks. They found Jesse's plastic flashlight sitting on a stump, completely undamaged and switched off, but not a single footprint, scrap of clothing, or drop of blood. It was like the mountain had simply opened its mouth and swallowed him whole. Silas took it incredibly hard. He stopped working the timber lines, sold his truck, and moved into an isolated, run-down cabin near an old, defunct limestone quarry called the Devil's Throat. Over the next 10 years, he became a ghost to our family. He didn't show up for holidays, and if you saw him in town buying groceries, he looked like a man who hadn't slept since the day Jesse disappeared. By the time I turned 24, I was working as a mechanic in Williamson, just trying to keep my head down. Jesse's disappearance was a permanent shadow over my life, but time has a way of turning sharp grief into a dull, background ache. That was until a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Silas walked into my shop. The smeared walls. The beam of light cut through the gloom, and my blood instantly turned to ice. The concrete walls of the tunnel weren't bare. They were entirely covered in thousands of tiny, frantic scratches, like someone had tried to claw their way out with bare fingernails. And above the scratches, painted in a thick, dark substance that looked like dried, blackening blood, were endless lines of text. It wasn't English. It looked like ancient geometric runes, all repeating a single, jagged symbol that looked like an upside-down eye. The smell hitting my nose wasn't rot. It was a stench so foul it made my stomach violently heave. The smell of burning fat, hot copper, and old death. "Vance, we need to leave. Right now," I whispered, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I turned around to face him. Uncle Vance was standing right in front of the warped iron gate, completely blocking the path back up to the surface. But he wasn't looking at the walls. He was staring directly at me, his eyes wide and completely bloodshot. In his right hand, he was holding a heavy, double-bitted logging axe. He hadn't brought it for clearing brush. He was holding it high, his muscles tensed, his face contorted into a terrifying manic grin. "I'm sorry, Caleb," Vance whispered, a tear escaping his eye, even as his grin widened. "The skinwalker in the deep, it doesn't want old meat. It wants the young blood. It took my father's mind, and it's going to take mine unless I give it what it asks for." Before I could even scream, Vance lunged, swinging the heavy axe directly at my face. Pure terror in the dark. The blade whistled past my ear, striking the concrete wall with a shower of brilliant sparks and a deafening crack that exploded my eardrums. Adrenaline flooded my system. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted blindly deeper into the pitch-black overflow tunnel, dropping my heavy flashlight to make myself harder to track. The beam shattered on the stone floor, leaving me in absolute, suffocating darkness. Behind me, I heard the brutal, scraping sound of Vance's boots running after me. He wasn't yelling. He was making a wet, clicking sound with his tongue, over and over again, like an animal tracking prey. Click, click, click. I ran blindly through the pitch, scraping my face and arms against the rough concrete walls, my lungs burning, my heart pounding so hard I could hear the pulse in my teeth. I felt the tunnel branch off to the left. I threw myself into the narrow side pipe, sliding into the wet muck on my stomach, pressing myself flat against the cold stone. I clamped both hands over my mouth, desperate to stifle my violent sobbing. For what felt like hours, there was only the sound of Vance's slow, rhythmic footsteps echoing through the main tunnel. Thud, thud, thud. Then he stopped right outside my side pipe. "I can hear your heart, Arthur," Vance whispered into the dark. My mind nearly fractured. Arthur was my grandfather's name. Vance wasn't in his right mind. He thought I was his dead father. But before Vance could step into my tunnel, the air changed completely. A violent, scorching wave of hot, pressurized wind roared out from the deepest recesses of the drainage system. It felt like sticking your face over a furnace. The stench intensified tenfold, the smell of burning flesh and wet ash. It was a smell that shouldn't exist in nature. Then came the sound. It wasn't a human sound. It was a wet, heavy, rhythmic thud drag, like something immense and boneless was pulling its massive weight along the floor of the tunnel. Vance stopped clicking. I heard the logging axe clatter to the concrete. "I brought him!" Vance suddenly shrieked, his voice climbing to a hysterical, ear-piercing scream. "I brought the bloodline! Take him and let me go! Take him!" His scream was cut short by a horrific, wet squelch. Through the pitch blackness, I heard the distinct, sickening sound of bones snapping like dry twigs, followed by a wet, tearing noise, like meat being ripped from a carcass. Vance didn't even have time to cry out again. There was just a low, vibrating hum that rattled the concrete beneath my chest, a sound that felt heavy with an ancient, mocking cruelty. I didn't wait. I didn't care about the noise. I scrambled backward out of the side pipe on my hands and knees, my palms tearing on the sharp rocks, and I ran. I ran toward the faint gray rectangle of daylight at the end of the tunnel, my legs screaming, my throat raw from terror. I didn't look back. I scrambled up the concrete incline of the sluice, sprinted through the briars, and didn't stop running until I burst into the state police barracks 3 hours later, covered in mud and my own blood. The state troopers went up there with a full rescue team. But when they reached the Red Creek sluice, they found the entire entrance of the overflow tunnel completely blocked. A massive sudden structural collapse had dropped hundreds of tons of solid concrete and rock, sealing the tunnel entirely. They told me there was no sign Vance had ever even been down there. They think he abandoned his Jeep and skipped town. But I know what I heard in the dark. And sometimes, on cold October nights when the wind blows down from the high ridges, I can still hear that wet, rhythmic clicking coming from the woods.